I found the empty velvet box on the top shelf of the closet while I was reaching for a winter scarf, and my hands started shaking before my mind could even understand why. Because the box that once held my grandmother's gold bracelet was suddenly light in my palms, and the room felt like it tilted as if the house itself had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. We lived in a quiet little town in Indiana where everyone waved when you drove by, and the high school football games were the biggest event of the week. Our apartment sat above a small insurance office and across the street from a grocery store that smelled like fresh bread every morning. I worked part-time at the public library, and my husband Mark worked full-time at an auto repair shop on the edge of town. Our life was simple and steady, and I had always believed it was honest. That bracelet was not just jewelry. It was the last thing my grandmother gave me before she passed. She pressed it into my palm while lying in a hospital bed, and told me to remember where I came from. I wore it on holidays, on birthdays, on the day Mark and I signed the lease for our first apartment, and I kept it in that velvet box when I wanted it safe. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the empty box, and I kept telling myself maybe I moved it. Maybe I had taken it to the jeweler for cleaning and forgotten, but my stomach knew better, and it curled into itself like it was trying to hide. That evening Mark came home smelling like motor oil and coffee from the gas station down the street. He kissed my cheek and asked what was for dinner, and I tried to match his normal tone while my heart was beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. I asked him if he had seen my bracelet, and he paused just long enough for the air between us to feel heavy. Then he said no and shrugged and started talking about a car that had been towed in that afternoon. I nodded and went to stir the pasta while my hands trembled over the stove. That night I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a train passing through town. I replayed his pause again and again, and every time it felt heavier, like something unspoken was sitting between us in the dark. Over the next few days I searched everywhere, the kitchen drawers, the bathroom cabinet, the pockets of old coats, even the small storage closet near the stairs, and each place I checked felt like another quiet goodbye to something I was not ready to lose. At work my coworker Linda asked why I looked tired, and I almost told her everything but the words stayed stuck in my throat, because saying them out loud would make them real, and I was not ready for that yet. Mark started staying late at work more often, and when I asked him about it he said business was busy and that the shop needed him. He smiled but his eyes did not meet mine and I felt a thin crack begin to form in the life I thought we were building. One afternoon I walked into the grocery store across the street, and saw a pawn shop flyer taped near the bulletin board by the entrance. It was advertising quick cash for gold and jewelry, and something in my chest tightened in a way I could not explain. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at that piece of paper while shoppers walked around me with carts full of cereal boxes and milk jugs, and I felt like I was standing still while the rest of the world kept moving forward. That night I asked Mark again about the bracelet, and this time he sighed and rubbed his face like he was tired of a conversation we had never really had. He told me I was worrying too much, and that it would turn up, and that we had bigger things to think about like rent and bills and the car payment, and his voice sounded calm but his words felt sharp. I nodded but inside I felt a small quiet fear begin to grow, because the life I trusted was starting to feel like a room with too many locked doors and not enough keys. I began paying attention to small things, the way he checked his phone quickly and turned the screen away, the way he avoided the closet where the velvet box used to sit, the way he talked about money with a tightness in his jaw that had not been there before. One Sunday afternoon I went to visit my mother who lived 2 towns over in a small white house with a porch swing that creaked when you sat on it. She made sweet tea and asked how married life was treating me and I almost broke down right there. But instead I smiled and said we were doing fine while my hands wrapped too tightly around the glass. On the drive back home I kept thinking about my grandmother's voice and the way she had squeezed my fingers when she gave me that bracelet, and the thought that it might be gone forever felt like losing her all over again. When I walked into the apartment Mark was sitting at the small kitchen table with a stack of envelopes. He looked up and smiled in a way that felt practiced, and he said we needed to talk about our finances, and my heart started beating faster before he even said another word. He talked about bills and unexpected expenses and how the shop had been slow last month and how he was trying to make things work. And I listened while my mind screamed a single quiet question that I was too afraid to ask out loud. Where is my bracelet? I nodded and told him we would figure it out together. But that night when he went to bed I sat in the living room with the lamp on low and felt tears slide down my cheeks because something was not right, and I could feel it in my bones. The next morning I stopped by the pawn shop on my way to work. It was a small narrow place with bars on the windows and glass cases full of watches and necklaces. My hands were shaking as I stepped inside, and the bell above the door rang softly. I asked the man behind the counter if anyone had brought in a gold bracelet recently, and he looked at me for a moment before asking me to describe it. My voice felt thin as I told him about the small flower engraving on the clasp, and the way it curved just slightly around the wrist. He nodded slowly and turned to check a drawer behind him while my heart felt like it was trying to climb out of my chest. And in that quiet narrow shop with the smell of dust and old metal hanging in the air, my whole life felt like it was standing on the edge of something I could not yet see but somehow already feared. He came back holding a small clear bag, and inside it was my bracelet, and for a second the world went silent like someone had turned down all the sound in my head. I stared at the tiny flower engraving and the familiar curve and my knees felt weak. He told me a man had sold it 2 weeks ago and asked if it belonged to me and I could barely whisper yes. He asked for the name of the person who sold it, and when he said Mark Carter my throat closed and my hands started to shake so badly, I had to hold the counter to keep from falling. I thanked him in a voice that did not sound like my own, and walked back out into the bright morning sunlight feeling like everything around me had shifted. I sat in my car for a long time with my forehead resting on the steering wheel, and cried in heavy quiet sobs, because the fear I had been trying to ignore was now real, and it had a name and a face, and it was the man I had trusted most in the world. At work that day I could barely focus. I shelved books and checked in returns while my mind replayed his pause and his late nights and his tight jaw. And suddenly all the small signs made sense in a way that hurt too much to accept. When I got home Mark was already there, sitting on the couch watching the local news, and he smiled and asked about my day like nothing had happened, and the normal sound of his voice felt like a knife in my chest. I sat down across from him and asked him quietly if he had sold my bracelet, and the room felt so still that I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. He looked confused for a second, and then his shoulders slumped and his eyes dropped to the floor, and he let out a long slow breath like he had been holding it in for weeks. And in that moment I knew the truth even before he said anything. He told me he was sorry, and that he had not wanted me to find out, and that he had only done it because he needed the money. And every word he said felt like it was pushing me further away from the life I thought we had. I asked him why he did not talk to me first, and he said he did not want to worry me and that he thought he could buy it back before I noticed. And I stared at him wondering how someone could look so much like the man I loved, and feel so much like a stranger. I went into the bedroom and took the empty velvet box off the shelf and brought it back into the living room, and set it on the coffee table between us. And I asked him to explain to me how selling the last gift from my grandmother was supposed to help us build a future. His voice cracked when he told me that he had a credit card debt he never told me about, and that he had been using it to help his younger brother who was struggling with rent and medical bills. And he said he thought he could handle it on his own without dragging me into it. I felt anger and sadness and confusion swirl together in my chest, and I stood up and walked into the bathroom and locked the door because I did not trust myself to speak without breaking apart. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and cried until my eyes burned and my chest hurt, and I kept thinking about trust and promises, and how fragile they really are when fear gets involved. When I came back out Mark was still sitting there with his hands folded and his head down, and he whispered that he was sorry again, and again like the words could somehow stitch the damage back together. I told him I needed time and I took my purse and my keys and left the apartment. Driving through the quiet streets of our town with tears blurring the stoplights and store signs until I ended up at my mother's house without really deciding to go there. She opened the door and pulled me into a hug before I even said anything, and I felt myself collapse into her arms like I had been holding myself together with string that had finally snapped. I told her everything in broken pieces, and she listened without interrupting, her hand rubbing slow circles on my back like she did when I was a child who had fallen off her bike. That night I slept in my old bedroom staring at the ceiling, and listening to the familiar creaks of the house, wondering how someone I loved could hurt me in such a quiet, invisible way. In the morning my phone was full of messages from Mark asking me to come home and promising he would fix everything. But I did not know how to answer because the problem was not just the bracelet anymore. It was the silence and the secrets and the way my trust had been traded for quick cash. I spent the day sitting on the porch swing watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes, and thinking about what it meant to share a life with someone, about honesty and fear, and the thin line between protecting someone and betraying them. By the time the sun started to set, I knew that going back would not be as simple as unlocking the apartment door and pretending nothing had happened, because something inside me had shifted, and I did not yet know how to find my way back to where we were before. That evening my mother made meatloaf and mashed potatoes and set the table like she always did, even when it was just the two of us. And the normal sound of silverware and the smell of gravy felt strange because my life felt anything but normal. She did not push me to make any decisions, and that somehow made everything feel heavier. After dinner I went outside and sat on the porch steps watching the sky turn soft pink and orange. And I kept thinking about how many small choices lead to big breaks, how one quiet secret could grow into something that cracked an entire marriage. Mark kept calling and texting, and I finally answered one message telling him I was safe but needed time, and my hands were shaking as I typed it because part of me still wanted him to come rushing in with some perfect explanation that would make everything okay. The next few days passed slowly. I went back to work and smiled at people and answered questions about books and late fees while my heart felt like it was carrying a quiet ache everywhere I went. Linda asked again if everything was okay, and this time I just nodded because I did not trust my voice. One afternoon while shelving books, I found a folded piece of paper tucked inside a returned novel. It was an old grocery receipt, and for a second it reminded me of how normal our life used to feel. Arguing about which cereal to buy, and whether to splurge on name-brand snacks. And I had to step into the back room and take a deep breath to steady myself. Mark finally came to my mother's house one Saturday afternoon. He stood on the porch looking smaller than I remembered, and he kept rubbing his hands together like he did when he was nervous. My mother let him in but stayed in the kitchen, giving us space but not distance. He told me again how sorry he was and how ashamed he felt, and how he had already talked to the pawn shop about buying the bracelet back. He said he would work extra hours and sell his old truck if he had to. And his voice shook when he said he did not want to lose me. I listened quietly, and when he finished I told him I needed to understand why he thought lying to me was easier than trusting me with the truth. And he looked down and said he was scared and did not want me to see him as a failure. Those words settled heavily in my chest because I had never thought of him as a failure. Not once. And the fact that he believed that about himself hurt almost as much as what he had done. I told him that marriage was supposed to be two people carrying things together, and not one person quietly breaking under the weight while pretending everything was fine. And he nodded with tears in his eyes and said he knew he had messed up. We sat in silence for a long time, and I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway, and the hum of the refrigerator, and it felt like time itself was waiting for me to decide what would happen next. I told him I was not ready to come home yet, and that I needed to see real change, not just words, and he said he understood and promised he would do whatever it took. After he left I sat on the porch swing again, and watched his car disappear down the street, and for the first time I allowed myself to admit that loving someone did not always mean staying no matter what. Sometimes it meant demanding honesty even if it hurt. That night I wrote in an old notebook I had not touched in years. I wrote about my grandmother and the bracelet, and about fear and trust, and the kind of marriage I wanted to have. And the more I wrote, the clearer my thoughts became. I realized I did not just want my bracelet back, I wanted my voice back. I wanted to feel safe asking questions and sharing worries and being part of every part of our life, even the messy parts. And in that quiet room with the soft glow of the lamp, I made a promise to myself that no matter what happened next, I would never again accept love that required me to ignore my own worth. The next week moved slowly and carefully, like everyone was walking on thin ice that could crack at any moment. Mark sent me pictures of the overtime sign-up sheet at the shop and screenshots of payments he had made on the credit card. And even though I appreciated the effort, it did not erase the ache in my chest, because trust was not a bill you could just pay off. I finally agreed to meet him at the small diner near the courthouse where we used to go on Saturday mornings, the place that served pancakes bigger than the plate, and had chipped blue mugs that never seemed to cool down. When I walked in, the smell of coffee and bacon hit me, and for a second it felt like stepping into a memory. Mark stood up when he saw me and looked like he had not slept much. His eyes were tired and his shoulders were tense. We sat across from each other and talked quietly about work and weather at first, because neither of us knew how to step back into the deeper conversation. He told me he had started seeing a counselor through the shop's insurance plan, because he realized he had been carrying fear and pride in a way that was hurting both of us. And I listened and nodded and felt a small flicker of hope that scared me because hope had a way of opening old wounds if it was not real. I told him about how scared I felt finding the empty box and about the night I cried in the car outside the pawn shop. And his eyes filled with tears and he whispered that he was so sorry he put me through that. We talked for almost 2 hours and by the time we stood up to leave my coffee was cold. And my head felt heavy, but my chest felt a little lighter than it had in days. I still did not go home that day, but I agreed to come by the apartment the next weekend to talk more. And as I drove away I noticed the trees starting to change color along the road, and thought about how seasons change whether you are ready or not. That weekend I walked into our apartment slowly, noticing everything like I was seeing it for the first time. The couch we bought at a thrift store, the chipped mug by the sink, the small framed photo of us at the county fair. And it all felt familiar and fragile at the same time. Mark had cleaned the place and left the bedroom door open like he wanted to show me he was not hiding anything. And we sat at the small kitchen table and went through our bills and his credit card statements together. And it felt strange but necessary to bring everything into the light. He showed me how much he still owed and what he was paying each month, and I felt a mix of anger and relief because I finally knew the truth, even if it was not pretty. We made a plan together to cut back on extras and put some money aside each week to buy the bracelet back. And as we wrote numbers down on a scrap piece of paper, I felt something shift again, not fixed but moving. When I left that night I stood in the doorway for a moment, and looked back at him and saw how scared he was of losing me. And it reminded me that people can hurt you not because they do not care but because they do not know how to face their own fears. I still did not move back in but I started calling him more often and checking in and slowly the wall between us began to feel a little less tall. And somewhere in the quiet space between anger and hope I began to believe that healing might be possible, even if it would not be fast or easy. Winter came quietly that year, bringing early sunsets and cold mornings that made the grocery store smell even warmer and sweeter when you walked in. And with the season came a strange calm between Mark and me. Not happiness yet but something softer, something careful. He kept his word about overtime and counseling, and every week he showed me the payment receipts without me asking. And each time he did it felt like another small brick being placed back into a wall that had once protected my heart. We started meeting on Sundays for coffee and walks through the small park by the river, the one with the wooden benches and the ducks that followed you if you had bread in your hand. And we talked about work and family, and sometimes about the hurt that still sat quietly between us. One afternoon he told me he had finally told his brother the truth, and had stopped sending him money he could not afford, and I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness because I could see how heavy that choice had been for him. The pawn shop called me one day while I was at the library and told me the bracelet was still there, and could be held for a few more weeks, and I sat at the circulation desk staring at the phone for a long time after I hung up, realizing how much that small piece of gold had come to symbolize. It was no longer just about my grandmother. It was about whether the man I loved could learn to choose honesty over fear. As Christmas approached, the town lit up with simple decorations, wreaths on doors, lights strung across Main Street, and the smell of pine trees filled the air. And Mark asked if he could come by my mother's house to help hang lights like he used to. We stood on ladders in the cold evening air stringing lights while my mother watched from the porch, and I felt the first real flicker of something that almost looked like forgiveness begin to form inside me. On Christmas Eve he handed me a small envelope instead of a wrapped gift. Inside was a receipt from the pawn shop showing a deposit he had made toward buying the bracelet back. And he told me it was not all of it yet, but it was a promise in paper form. I held that receipt in my hands and felt tears sting my eyes because for the first time since everything had happened I felt like he was not just saying he was sorry, he was showing it. We stood there under the soft glow of Christmas lights, and I realized that healing was not a single moment, but a series of choices made over and over again. I still did not move back in that night, but I hugged him longer than I had in months and whispered that I saw his effort, and that it mattered. As I drove back to my mother's house through the quiet snowy streets, I felt something close to peace settle over me. And for the first time in a long while I slept through the night without waking up to fear sitting in my chest. January came with clear cold mornings and icy sidewalks, and with it came the quiet routine of rebuilding something that had been shaken. Mark kept going to counseling and sometimes he shared things he was learning about fear and pride, and how he had grown up believing he had to handle everything alone. and hearing that did not erase what he had done, but it helped me understand the walls he had built around himself. We started meeting twice a week, sometimes for dinner at the small pizza place near the movie theater, sometimes just sitting in my mother's living room talking about our days, and slowly our conversations began to feel less careful and more natural again. One evening he came over holding a small paper bag, and inside it were my favorite oatmeal cookies from the bakery on Main Street, and something simple about that small thoughtful gesture made me cry because it reminded me of how he used to notice little things about me. The pawn shop called again and said the bracelet would be available for pickup at the end of the month. And when I told Mark, he closed his eyes and let out a long breath like he had been holding it for weeks. We decided to go together to get it, and the idea of walking back into that narrow shop filled me with nerves, but also with a strange sense of closure. On a gray Tuesday afternoon we drove there in silence, the radio playing softly in the background, and when we stepped inside the familiar bell rang above the door. And my heart beat faster just like it had the first time. The man behind the counter recognized me and nodded, then reached into the same drawer, and brought out the small clear bag again. And when he placed it on the counter, I felt tears rise in my eyes, because it felt like seeing an old friend you were afraid you had lost forever. Mark paid the remaining balance without looking at me, and then slid the bag toward me, and his hands were shaking as much as mine had been weeks earlier. I took the bracelet out and fastened it around my wrist, feeling the cool gold against my skin. And for a moment the world felt like it paused just long enough for me to breathe. We walked out into the cold afternoon air, and Mark stopped on the sidewalk and looked at me and said he was sorry again. But this time his voice did not sound like a habit. It sounded like a promise. We stood there quietly while people walked past us carrying grocery bags and coffee cups, and I realized that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing what you wanted your future to look like. That night I went back to my mother's house and looked at the bracelet on my wrist, and felt like I had brought a piece of my grandmother back with me. And something inside my chest finally began to soften in a way it had not since the day I found the empty velvet box. A few days later I packed a small overnight bag and drove back to the apartment for the first time since everything had happened. My heart was beating fast as I climbed the stairs and unlocked the door, and the quiet inside felt both familiar and strange. Mark stood in the kitchen like he had been waiting there for hours, and when he saw me his shoulders dropped in relief, and he smiled in that soft, careful way he had learned over the past months. We did not pretend everything was suddenly fine. Instead we sat at the table and talked about boundaries and honesty and what we both needed to feel safe again. And it was not easy, but it felt real. I told him I needed him to talk to me about money and stress instead of hiding it, and he promised he would. And he told me he needed to feel like he was not disappointing me, and I promised to be honest about my fears too. That night I slept in our bed again, and listened to the familiar sounds of the building settling and the hum of the heater. And even though my heart was still cautious, I felt something like hope settle gently beside me. In the weeks that followed we slowly slipped back into a routine, cooking dinner together, watching old sitcom reruns, walking to the grocery store for small things like milk and bread. And every small shared moment felt like another stitch in something that had been torn. We started putting money aside not just for bills, but for small plans like a weekend trip and a new couch someday. And planning for the future together again felt like a quiet victory. One afternoon I caught Mark looking at my bracelet, and he smiled softly and said he was glad it was back where it belonged. And I nodded and touched it, feeling grateful and cautious all at once. Sometimes the hurt still surfaced in quiet ways, like when he stayed late at work or when money felt tight, but now we talked about it instead of letting it sit in silence. And that made all the difference. And little by little I began to feel like the life we were building was no longer resting on secrets but on truth, and that made it feel stronger than before even though it had been tested by pain. Spring slowly returned to our town, bringing soft rain and fresh green leaves that made Main Street look brighter than it had in months. And with it came a feeling of new beginnings that seemed to match what was happening quietly inside our home. Mark surprised me one Saturday by asking if I wanted to plant flowers on the small balcony outside our apartment, and we spent the afternoon at the garden center picking out simple pots and packets of seeds, laughing when dirt spilled on the floor of his truck. Back home we filled the pots together and pressed seeds into the soil with our fingers, and something about doing that simple hopeful act made me realize how much we had both changed. How we were learning to grow again instead of just survive. We started having dinner with neighbors more often, sitting on folding chairs in the shared courtyard, while kids rode their bikes in circles. And someone always brought a radio that played old country songs, and it felt good to belong to something again without fear sitting in my chest. At the library, I took on more hours and started saving a little of my own money, not because I did not trust Mark, but because I wanted to feel strong and secure within myself too. One evening my mother came over and sat at our small kitchen table drinking tea and watching us talk and tease each other. And later she told me quietly that she was proud of how we were handling things, and her words felt like a blessing. Mark continued counseling and sometimes shared stories about learning to speak up when he felt overwhelmed, and I shared my fears instead of holding them inside. And we both learned that love did not mean carrying pain alone. On a warm April night, we walked down to the river park and sat on a bench watching the water move slowly under the streetlights. And Mark reached for my hand in that careful way he had learned and said thank you for not giving up on him. I squeezed his hand and told him that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing to build something better with open eyes. And in that quiet moment by the river, I realized that our marriage was no longer what it had been before, but it was becoming something deeper, something more honest, something that had learned to breathe again. We were still healing, still learning, but we were finally walking forward together instead of in silence. Summer arrived with long warm evenings and the sound of cicadas filling the air, and by then our home no longer felt like a place where secrets could hide. It felt like a place where truth was allowed to sit at the table with us. One evening we were sitting on the balcony watching the small flowers we had planted finally bloom. And Mark quietly took my hand, and told me that counseling had helped him face the part of himself that believed love meant carrying everything alone. He said he was learning that real love meant letting someone see your fear, and still choose you. I looked at the bracelet on my wrist catching the soft sunset light, and thought about my grandmother, and the way she had trusted me with something precious. And I realized she had not just given me jewelry, she had given me a reminder to protect my worth. We talked about the months we had been through, the nights of silence, the fear, the tears, and the slow rebuilding. And for the first time those memories no longer felt like open wounds. They felt like scars that told a story of survival and growth. I told Mark that finding that empty velvet box had almost broken me, but that it had also forced us to finally speak honestly and face what we had both been afraid to admit. And he nodded and said he knew our marriage would never be the same, but he believed it could be stronger. That night we sat quietly listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep, the distant hum of traffic, the soft laughter of neighbors drifting through open windows, and I felt something inside me finally settle into peace. Our life was still simple, still full of bills and early mornings and grocery lists, but it was no longer built on silence, it was built on truth, and that made all the difference. And the life lesson I carry now is this: love is not proven by how well you hide your struggles. It is proven by how bravely you share them, because trust grows only in the light, and anything kept in the dark has the power to quietly break what you are trying to protect. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more real-life emotional stories.